Good evening. I'll let the good evening rest for a moment till everyone has found their place and seat. We are starting just about on time, and those of you who were not able to have enough of the hors d'oeuvres and are still looking forward to supper, I hope we'll keep our evening on time. But I think the real feast tonight is going to come in just about 10 minutes when you've heard from me and we turn to our guest speaker about whose talk we're very excited tonight. I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to what is really an inaugural session of a new venture for Harvard Divinity School in this newly formed Leadership Council. This is a council that gives us an opportunity to do a number of things that I think we probably should be doing. It's obviously helpful to us to have leaders from various walks of life and various places around the country and even around the world who know about what we're doing and can help to build our networks. That certainly is maybe what we get out of this, and we're delighted about that. But I also think that this is that part of this kind of a group and this kind of a meeting relates to our own, what I consider our responsibility as an educational institution working in the areas that our faculty work in, to be engaged in the issues of today that bear upon religion in particular. So this is an opportunity for us to bring together a group of distinguished leaders from across the professional spectrum, and that we certainly welcome, because we know that all of you, in some measure, share our interest in religion and in religious studies and its relationship to the other areas of life where most of you are active. We also see it as an opportunity to share on our part some of the public issue concerns that belong to, or at least are an extension of, the larger scholarly work that goes on at the Divinity School. We also see it as an opportunity to enable you to engage productively with one another and with many of us here at HDS in trying to achieve and gain a better understanding of religion so that we all profit by discussing our shared experience and concerns for its role in the world today, which is a role, as we all are very well aware, both for evil and for good. And therefore, it's also an opportunity, I think, to help us improve what we are doing at HDS, to sharpen our awareness of the issues that we need to be dealing with. And I hope it will also contribute in some ways to what you can do to contribute more effectively in your own spheres and your own organizations and communities in issues that are related to the things we talk about here, whether it's religion and civil society or whatever we might take up in what we rather hope are going to become annual meetings that will allow us, those of us here as scholars and those of you in many walks of life, to exchange ideas and to talk together across a spectrum of interests. Let me say, if you don't mind, if you'll allow me to be the dean at the Divinity School for a few minutes before I introduce our speaker, unaccustomed as I am, although I'm gradually, after 3 years, getting sort of accustomed to doing this, to talking about the Divinity School and about our programs, about which I'm really quite excited. And I frankly, when I came across the fence, as I always say, from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences 3 years ago, to take up the deanship here, having served there for some 30 years on the faculty, I didn't really know, I think, quite what to expect. Not that I had not taught divinity students, worked with divinity faculty, and advised divinity doctoral candidates and all sorts of things. I was certainly not unaware. But I did discover that there was just so much that I didn't know. And for me, the last 3 years have been a learning experience. And let me just try in 5 minutes to encapsulate some of the things that I understand now about the school and that I can at least share briefly with you for those of you that don't really know very much about who we are and what we do. Our mission at HDS is really to train scholars and leaders who are rigorously educated, we hope, we trust, with an understanding of the world's religious traditions. That is, not just their own, and not just in one special area of interest or emphasis. Our approach, I think, to religious and theological education is in many ways today unique, or has the potential, I think, to be unique, even on the American educational scene. I think it is that because of the fact that we strive here to integrate professional education for diverse kinds of ministry, for diverse kinds of people, ministry and many other vocations, religious vocations, not just for Christians, but for people of many other faiths, and not just for one kind of Christian, but for many different varieties. And we strive to integrate this professional education with the scholarship of the academy in religious studies and in theological studies that goes on at a lot of other places as well. There just aren't really any other places that quite in the same way try to bring these two things together in one institution. Certainly at Yale Divinity School, whose name we don't usually utter here in full, but or at the University of Chicago in the Divinity School there, it's probably our two chief points of comparison. There are brilliant scholars and there's wonderful work being done in all of these fields. But even there you find that there's a very different setup, whether it's because there's a religion department at Yale that supposedly handles religious studies and then Yale Divinity School handles theological and professional studies, or whether it's Chicago where the emphasis is very much on the master's and doctoral programs there. We're in an institution that in fact is striving to join together everything from instruction of undergraduates in Harvard College, which our faculty is heavily engaged in, with instruction for the MDiv program in ministry, and certainly also the very large master's program of the MTS and our doctoral studies. And we try to do all that in some sense under one roof, or as part of one group of scholars that span both divinity and arts and sciences. I guess at least in that regard, since now I span those two faculties, I suppose that I at least am in some measure a representative of what Harvard is about in this area. I'm certainly not the only one. I mean, I see Diana X sitting here who spans it and has spanned it far longer than I have, far better, since back in the late 70s. At least when we both were young junior professors together over in arts and sciences. And there are many others. Let me make a couple more points just about our identity as a school, though, beyond this I think rather unique mixing of missions. Our Christian and Unitarian history in this school, going back now just about almost 2 centuries, is sustained in our ongoing core strength in Judeo-Christian tradition, certainly, and we continue to see that as where our primary strengths lie. But as a non-sectarian school, we draw students from an array of denominations and traditions, as I've already indicated in passing. Increasingly, that means students not just from the Jewish tradition on the one hand, the Christian or Unitarian on the other, but also from Muslim, Buddhist, Sikh, Hindu, and many other traditions. From that pluralistic world that, again, my colleague Dr. Eck has written about with such forcefulness, we draw from pluralistic America and indeed the pluralistic globe. We have students from around the globe. We'd like to have more, and in fact, if we had more money to support them better, we probably could bring more from around the world. But we do pride ourselves on being an international community of the world's religious traditions. Also, we encourage our faculty to work at the thresholds of knowledge and research rather than simply focusing on limited discipline-specific topics. I think in the colloquy of working with each other and also in the classroom in a place like Harvard, it's very difficult to be too narrow in one's focus, and I think that's a very good thing. I think you'll see tomorrow when we have several of our new faculty who have just arrived to join us that the kind of people whom we choose and who are willing to choose us and come here to work with us are doing the kind of exciting cross-disciplinary work, and they range across subjects and fields in a way that, to my mind, bodes extremely well for the future of studies in both religion and theological studies. Our 3 largest academic programs, for those of you that are not aware of these, are the Master of Divinity program, the Master of Theological Studies, and the Doctor of Theology program. Those 3 programs define our major academic foci. We have another small late career master's program, but it's very small. And I hope that maybe within the next couple of years we may even think about another kind of maybe 1-year master's program for people in the professions, but there we're not quite that far yet, as my faculty reminds me whenever I raise the issue. But we, I hope, will get there. The Master of Divinity program, of course, maybe is the signature program of any divinity school, and it prepares students for careers in ministry, but ministry of very diverse kinds. And I think people in general outside the divinity school are not aware of how many different careers our Master of Divinity people go out to. And of course, they're probably particularly not aware that we have Muslims and Jews and Buddhists studying alongside Christians and Unitarians, and Christians, they're also Catholics and Protestants and so forth, evangelicals and liberal religious tradition people from within the Christian tradition. We have quite a variety of people doing this professional degree program and planning to go out to work in some sector of public life that is involved with religion. It may be NGOs, it may be hospital chaplaincies, it may be parish ministry, it may be to go on to do training for the rabbinate. It may be someone who actually is going to go maybe out to Naropa and complete their training to be a Buddhist monk and have a Buddhist temple somewhere in Middle America. The variety is really quite stunning, and I think it's one of the riches here. The Master of Theological Studies program, our largest program, which has now, I think this year, a steady state of around 210, 220 students between the 2 years of the degree. Prepares students to pursue careers in scholarship on the one hand. Many of these people certainly come in, even if they don't go out, planning to go on to doctoral studies and higher education, but also in many other fields. And here particularly, it's really quite striking. We have a wonderful program in religion and secondary education that is unique. There's no other program, to my knowledge, in existence that trains people to go out and teach religion in public and private schools on this continent. And that is a very exciting program that has been very successful and has been run on a shoestring, continues to be run on a shoestring, but is having wonderful success. We have students who go on to journalism, to law, to public policy, to medicine, and of course to all kinds of public service, NGOs, government service, all kinds of careers. And it's quite striking to see how many people are out there doing these things. Many even go into the private sector and take on mammon as well. So that's also good. We need these kind of people in the business world, as many of you know. And, of course, our Doctor of Theology and the shared Doctor of Philosophy program with the Yard prepares students for careers in academia, research, and teaching. And we, in fact, supply, along with Chicago and Yale and, I suppose, one or two other institutions, Princeton and one or two others, really supply most of the religion departments in liberal arts colleges and universities around this country, as well as many people in seminaries as well. So that remains, of course, a very great strength of the Divinity School. And finally, as I've indicated earlier, we also teach many undergraduates here, and I, of course, have spent most of my career focusing on undergraduate education, and I consider that hugely important. And much of the faculty strength in the comparative study of religion, where I've worked for 33 years, is, in fact, always has come from the divinity faculty. And that, I think, will continue to be the case. I hope we'll regularize that and make it even stronger. So I think these are exciting times for the Divinity School. We're in the midst of an era of growth and of refining our mission and purpose. We're working on new curricula for each of our programs, and we are continuing to attract, I think, the best and brightest in the way of the student bodies that we put together for each of our degree programs. And we continue to have our problems, as every institution does. We do not support our students with financial aid at the levels that they need to be supported. We have those problems. We are now to the end of our space, and we've added very strongly to the faculty. How are you, Joe? We've added very strongly to the faculty, and we're going to need more space, and we're beginning to plan for that. So there's a lot that's going to be going on. We'd like to be doing more outreach beyond our own students and the academy, and this kind of gathering, I hope, is a first step in that direction. So I welcome you tonight. I hope I haven't gone on too long with trying to familiarize you with some of the things that are at the center of what we are doing, but I wanted just you to hear this before we plunge into our real program. And let me, with no further ado, turn to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Rami Khoury, who is editor-at-large for the Daily Star in Beirut. Rami Khouri is as many of you know, an internationally recognized and syndicated columnist and author. Born in the U.S., he is a Palestinian Jordanian by background who received BA and MS degrees from Syracuse University. He's currently the editor-at-large of the Beirut-based Daily Star, a newspaper that for a whole year while I studied in a small British Foreign Office school high in the Lebanese mountains that I read regularly as one of my lifelines to the wider world up in the mountains of Lebanon back in the mid-'60s. So I have fond memories of the Daily Star. This is a newspaper published throughout the Middle East now in conjunction with the International Herald Tribune. So it is an influential English language newspaper in the Arab world. Rami and his wife make their home in Amman and Nazareth, and their two sons are now studying, I believe, still in U.S. universities. So he is no stranger to this country as well as to the countries of the Middle East and Europe. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks in the U.S. and throughout the war in Iraq, Mr. Khouri has emerged as a highly insightful observer and analyst of religion and politics in the Middle East and beyond, if any of you have read any of his commentaries. He's a frequent commentator on Middle East politics for prominent news outlets, including NPR, CNN, and the BBC. He's also general manager and co-owner of Al-Qutbah. Is it Qutbah? It is Qutbah, okay. Al-Qutbah Publishers in Amman, a senior associate at the Global Affairs Institute at Syracuse, and a fellow of the Royal Institute for Interfaith Studies in Amman. Even more impressive, I think, I understand that he's also chief umpire for Little League Baseball in all of Jordan. So he's also been a member of the Brookings Institution Task Force on his lesser accomplishments, the Task Force on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World, and has served as an advisor to the Jordanian Ministry of Tourism on biblical archaeological sites. In 2001-2002, he was a Nieman Fellow here at Harvard, where I understand he took a large number of divinity courses and knows more of the faculty probably than I did 5 years ago. And he focused during his Nieman time here on the links between religion, identity, national history, and how values enter into governance systems. I really cannot imagine a better person to be our keynote speaker tonight, and I will subside and let you hear from him. Rami, it's a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Graham, and all of you for coming out here tonight during the tail end of the hurricane. I was deeply honored and humbled to be asked to join the Leadership Council and also to speak to you tonight. I've spent many years of my life in the Middle East interacting with audiences in the United States and the Western world through the mass media and through conferences, lectures, but to be asked to do a task like this was deeply gratifying for me, and I just want to tell you how much I'm grateful for that, and also for the experience I had when I was able to be at Harvard as an Nieman Fellow and attend many courses at the Divinity School. I ended up taking auditing most of the courses. I audited courses at the Divinity School. I took about 6 or 7 courses. And I must tell you that it was not just a tremendous academic experience in terms of learning things, but it really was a very meaningful and powerful experience for me to interact with the professors, especially that you have here at the Divinity School, and people like Paul Hansen and Harvey Cox and John Levinson and others, and some of them are here. And I just want to acknowledge that this was a tremendously meaningful experience, and it wasn't quite a transformational experience on the road to Damascus, but it was almost that. It was a really powerful experience in learning not just about the knowledge and scholarship and richness of the academy here, but also about the humanism of the American spirit and of American individuals of all religions. And it was a tremendous moment for me in my interaction between the United States and the Middle East, coming here for a year, learning about theology and history and culture and religion and ethics and all these issues, and then going back to the Middle East and using that experience, to what I had learned, using that to continue my work in journalism, which for me is very much focused these days on trying to interpret the Middle East for the Westerners and trying to help Middle Easterners understand the West a little bit better. I am very much a bicultural person with a foot in both worlds. And I have a few thoughts that I want to share with you about religion and politics in the Middle East. But just first a note on credentials, to establish my credentials. In the Divinity School, it's difficult for you to get somebody who is closer to the divine than me. My name is Khoury, which means priest. My family comes from Nazareth. I'm Palestinian. And my great-great-great-great-grandfather rebuilt the church of the Greek Orthodox Church of the Annunciation, which is built over Mary's Well. For those of you who've been to Nazareth, that's my family church. And those are pretty impressive divine credentials, at least proximity to the divine, at least, or the landscape of the divine. But I'm also from a Muslim culture. And from a tradition of deep interaction with Jewish colleagues and friends in the Middle East. So on that occasion, I would wish our Muslim colleagues Ramadan Kareem, and for our Jewish colleagues, greetings for the recent high holy days, and for the rest of you, go Red Sox. So having established these important elements of our identity, let me share with you some thoughts from what I have learned living in a Muslim culture with a powerful tradition of interaction with Jewish friends and colleagues, and being a Christian myself, and also having a foot in both worlds, the West and the Middle East. I think there is a big problem in the U.S. today and in the Western world in general, but it is particularly a problem in the U.S. In terms of oversimplifying the symbolism and the role of the Islamic religion in the Middle East and in the world. Obviously, this is a consequence mainly of the problem of terrorism that we have all suffered from. But the issue really is not one of religion. The issue is one primarily of first separating. My experience tells me, of living in the last 35, 40 years in the Middle East, is to separate religion from politics, from nationalism, from historical memory, from issues of identity, from living conditions, and from historical political grievances. That these have to be separated into each one of these is a separate issue, and many of them overlap, and in some cases they all come together to create very powerful human emotions and political emotions that often translate into political movements and sometimes translate into political violence. This has happened to all the religions in the Middle East. Jewish, Christian, and Muslim over the years have at various times turned to political violence. These are well-documented historical facts. Nobody is immune to the charge of terrorism, but everybody can explain why they turned to political violence. To understand the use of political violence, whether it's justifiable resistance or unjustifiable terrorism, is not to condone it, but you need to understand it, and you need to understand the wider sentiments in the environment that spawns political violence to be able to come up with a practical and effective and legitimate strategy to address it, something which I think the United States and the Western world has not done, certainly not since 9/11. The important point that I would make is that the symbols and the vocabulary of religion in the Middle East, particularly the Muslim Islamic symbols and vocabulary of religion, hide other more prominent concerns, distortions, tensions, grievances, and distresses that are expressed and manifested in religious expressions, in religious symbolism, and in religious vocabulary. But the reality is that beneath the religious external symbolism is a catalog of grievances, most of them legitimate, that really need to be understood and addressed if we are to deal with the issue of the terror phenomenon that has come out of the Middle East recently and plagues the Middle East more than it plagues the West, but more important than that, to deal with the wider tensions between people in the Middle East and people in the US and in the Western world in general. I would suggest that I would give you a couple of ideas that I think explain why we have such strong Islamist political movements in the Middle East. And I use the word Islamist, meaning the movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, Hezbollah, movements that are by and large peaceful political movements. Now, I know that people like Hezbollah and Hamas are often singled out in the United States and accused of terrorism. And certainly there have been situations where they have been engaged in terrorism. But what I'm saying is that the wide majority of Islamist political movements are political, social, economic movements that have emerged from a modern historical context in the Middle East and have become the single most widespread and legitimate and powerful political protest group in the Middle East, and I think are now moving beyond being just protest groups, but perhaps moving into mainstream politics, and if given a chance to compete peacefully in politics, as they were not in Algeria in 1992 when they won an election and were deprived the ability to rule, is that they will probably emerge as the dominant political force in peaceful democratic elections. And we've seen a hint of this in Algeria, in Turkey, where the Islamist movement has gradually taken over the government and is a member of NATO and is now negotiating membership in the European Union. But why is there this widespread support for these groups? First of all, they're indigenous, they're credible, they're local, they're legitimate. They speak the language of the indigenous religion. They're not alien concepts that come from far away or overseas. They're easy to market. People, when you talk to Muslims in the language of Islam, they understand what you're talking about and they respond to it. The second point that's very important to understand is that it's the nature of religion to do what many Muslims are doing and many Islamist movements are doing in the Middle East. It is the nature of religion, and this is where I speak with deep humility in front of an audience like this. But my analysis is that it is the nature of religion to offer hope where there is only hopelessness and distress, to offer a sense of possible justice where there is injustice and subjugation and occupation, to challenge oppression, to challenge unjust regimes. This is what one of the things that religions are designed to do. And whether we accept that religions are a man-made creation or a divine creation or somewhere in between, this is a practical political role that religions have played and continue to play throughout history. Third reason is the lack of any other available options in society for people to interact through peaceful, normal political means to achieve a redressive grievance. When you don't have the ability to act in civil society or in political life or in democratic governments or to speak out in the press or to talk in universities freely, when those options are not available to you, religion is almost always the option that people turn to. Because it cannot be taken away from you, and even when governments try to take it away from you, people still use religion. The fourth reason is the failure of most of the other political movements and mass movements in the Middle East in the last 40, 50 years of Arab nationalism and Baathism and socialism, state nationalism, any kind of movement that you look at has generally failed to catch fire and to spark a serious political transformation and serious responding to people's needs. Fifth reason is that these Islamist movements have offered very practical and meaningful services to people on a large scale. Social services, nursery schools, kindergartens, daycare centers, medical centers, vocational training, literacy training, basic services that respond to the real needs of real people on a large scale throughout the region. A sixth reason in some places is that these Islamist movements actually spearheaded political resistance against military occupation, particularly in South Lebanon and in parts of the West Bank and Gaza, but also historically, most of the Arab nationalists, most of the national liberation movements around the Middle East, and by and large, were mostly successful when they combined nationalism with religious Islamic identity in many Middle Eastern countries. So the national liberation dimension of these movements is very important. And a seventh reason is that they offer people a sense of being able to deal with a historical redress of grievance. For instance, the revolution in Iran for Iranians back in '79 was a tremendously powerful response, delayed 25 years to the overthrow of Mossadegh by the CIA. So there are deep historical grievances that last for decades and decades, and Islamist movements often allow people finally to address these grievances. These are seven main reasons that I would mention why these Islamist movements have such profound resonance and meaning around the Middle East. I should be careful to emphasize again that I make a very clear distinction between legitimate mainstream Islamist political movements that carry the symbols of Islam and talk the language of Islam and religion, and differentiate those from the criminal terror groups like Bin Laden and Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi and people of that nature who go around attacking civilians, whether they're Americans or Iraqis or other Arabs, and even in situations in Palestine, for instance, blowing up a pizza parlor in Tel Aviv is not legitimate national resistance. That is terrorism. In the same way that I would say that an Israeli F-16 bombing a neighborhood and killing 10 Palestinian children is also terrorism. So there's a legitimate difference. There's a clear difference between terrorism and legitimate political expression and manifestation of an identity and political activism. And I'm talking about the legitimate mass groups who represent probably tens of millions, if not maybe hundreds of millions of people in the Middle East. And why is it that these groups are so credible? I think there are five main crises in the Middle East, and the Islamist political movements respond to the needs of individuals and to collective communities in each of these five crises. And I would give you the five crises that define most of the Arab world and other parts of the Middle East as there is, first of all, a crisis of sustainable human development and responding to human needs, the water, jobs, etc. There's a crisis of sensible and stable statehood, of countries whose borders are clear, whose security is guaranteed by its own people, of countries that don't have civil war and internal violence and threats. There is a crisis of citizenship rights, of individual rights. What does it mean to be a citizen of Syria or Jordan or Egypt? What rights do you have as a citizen? What are the limits of the ability of your country, your state, your government, your security services to deny your human rights? A citizenship crisis is prevalent all over the region. There's a crisis of identity at many levels: the state, the secular versus the religious, the individual versus the communal, the local versus the national. This tribalism, ethnicity, nationalism, transnationalism, all of these are identities that are very confused and often conflicted in the region. And fifth of all, there is a historical crisis of coexistence between Arabism, Zionism in Israel, and Western powers, a crisis that dates back probably 150 to 200 years. In all five of these crises, which dominate and define most of the Middle East, the Islamist political movements provide the individual person and the groups, the collective groups, whether it's a tribe or a family or a whole region or a whole country or the Islamic Ummah, however you define yourself in the Islamic world, each one of these five crises finds an antidote in the expression of political Islam. So what I'm saying is that what we have are very real, historical and continuing reasons for masses and masses of people in the Middle East to turn to their religion to deal with this whole array of stresses, of distortions, of tensions that plague them and humiliate them and anger them, and for a few people dehumanize them to the extent that they become dehumanized, they stop being human, and they act like animals, and they get involved into terrorism and other destructive deeds. So when you hear people speaking the language of religion, when you see the symbols of religion and peaceful political activism, I think it's critically important to look beyond the religious vocabulary and the religious symbols to the underlying political and social and economic and historical and identity and other realities. And I would leave you with only one thought, which is from my own experience in this country. I'm a big student of the civil rights movement and a big admirer of what was done in the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement in this country was led by the churches. It spoke in the vocabulary of Christianity. Martin Luther King and Abernathy and all the people who led the movement, most of them were preachers. When you wanted to know about the civil rights movement, you didn't go and read the Bible necessarily. You went and read the American Constitution, and you asked, why is this Constitution not applied to all Americans? When you want to understand why Muslims are speaking in the language of religions, read the Quran, but go beyond the Quran and read the Arab constitutions, read the Universal Charter of Human Rights, read the laws of the Arab countries that are not applied evenly. Look beyond the religious dimension into the underlying human reality and ask yourself why these people are using the religion to give them hope, to give them a sense of change, and that a better future may be. And use this, I would urge, to explore the incredible opportunity we have now for Americans and Arabs and Muslims and Westerners and Jews and all people in the region and in the West and in the Middle East to meet at that one meeting place where we've never met, which is the promotion of democracy for all people and freedom for all people in Iraq, in Palestine, in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia. Freedom, democracy, equality for all people as a win-win situation that not only taps the common religious values that define us all as Abrahamic children, but that define the constitutional and republican values that all of us aspire to and all of us have in our constitutions, but that we don't all apply equally. This is the challenge and this is the opportunity, and for the first time in modern history, I think there is an opportunity for Arabs and Americans, individuals, civil society, activists, academics, government people, diplomats, to work together for this common goal, because it is what masses of people are saying in the Arab world, including Islamists who are getting into elections peacefully, including the American government. It's an unprecedented opportunity, and to understand the religious dimension of this political movement in the Middle East is probably one of the keys to unlocking a better future than the one that we have now. Thank you very much.
Mr. Khoury has kindly agreed, as I'm sure you're all delighted, to take questions. So I think we'll just open the floor and I'll let him recognize people as he sees them.
Mr. Khoury, could you, maybe I didn't hear it clearly, but I seem to hear you distinguish between terrorism for Al-Qaeda and terrorism for Hamas. You seem to justify Hamas terrorism, but not Al-Qaeda terrorism. Could you talk a little about this?
Yeah, sure. No, I don't justify any terrorism. I condemn all terrorism. What I'm saying is that there are gradations, and there's a huge argument about this. What is terrorism? What is legitimate self-defense? And what is legitimate struggling against occupation? We have to remember historically in the Middle East, it's important to keep this in mind. Among the earliest terror incidents were the pre-state Jewish Zionist groups against the British. And of course the British have posters of Begin and, as wanted terrorists. Then they stopped being terrorists when they got their state. You had Christians who were involved in terrorism. Some of the Palestinians, like George Habash, who were hijacking airplanes, that's terrorism. So you had Christians involved in terrorism, and that's terrorism, and it must be condemned. And you have now Muslims and others who are involved in terrorism. The distinction that I was making is that the distinction between peaceful political participation and unacceptable terrorist actions. So if a Hamas person blows up a bus in Tel Aviv, that's terrorism. There's no question about it. I condemn it as a Palestinian deeply and to my dying breath, I will condemn it. Any kind of terrorism against civilians of any kind of this nature is unacceptable and must be fought, and I say this publicly in the Middle East as I say it here. What I'm saying is that you have groups like Hamas, for instance, who have an arm that does this, but they also have now just won the municipal elections in about 15 municipal governments in the Middle East. So there are groups that politically act in a legitimate way, offer tremendously important social services, reflect the human demands and needs of their people, and also have a military or sometimes even a terrorist wing. The IRA is the best example, and the best example of dealing with terrorism is what the United States and the British did in Northern Ireland, which is separate the criminal terrorists from the legitimate political actors and grievances, address the terrorists through legitimate police means and take them to court and catch them and put them in prison after giving them a fair trial if they're found guilty, and address the legitimate political grievances that come out of that entire society in Northern Ireland through legitimate political responses, which is exactly what the United States has helped to do in Northern Ireland. And you now have the IRA no longer being called a terrorist group. In fact, the British government has officially said their arms have been decommissioned, and the British government is now giving the IRA development funds. Again, 2 weeks ago they announced this. So this is a tremendously relevant experience about how you separate the terrorist dimension from the legitimate political and cultural and social and human dimension of these groups. And we need to do this across the board. We need to do it for Hamas, we need to do it for the Israeli armed forces, we need to do it for the American armed forces in the Middle East, for people in the Taliban, for every group. The operative principle of freedom and liberty in the American lexicon is that freedom is indivisible. Well, we take that seriously in the Middle East, and we want this to be indivisible. We want freedom and democracy to be applied evenly across the board. When it is selectively applied, it takes away some of the credibility of the American government or other governments or Arab governments, whoever is talking about this. So applying these standards across the board is critically important.
The recent case of the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Erotheus, did it have any effect of the perception of the Islamists towards the Christians and the perception of separation of religion from politics?
Well, the Greek Orthodox Church, to my great dismay as a Greek Orthodox, is involved in some shady dealings, has been involved, but we know from this country and other places that churches and church people sometimes do criminal, terrible things. The important thing is, how do you deal with them? Is there a mechanism to address the problem? There has been an effort in the Greek Orthodox Church to redress this problem, and also there is a feud or a contest between the Greek Orthodox hierarchy of the church and Arabs who wanted to become an Arab church. So there is some tension there that's going on. But clearly it does have besmirches to an extent the view of Christians among Muslims. So this is definitely a problem. But I think it's a problem that will be dealt. It's a confined, narrow problem that will be dealt with by the church.
Religious minorities in the Middle East are responding to the 5 crises that you mentioned, that is, various forms of Christianity, Druze, Baha'i, and so forth.
I couldn't talk in any sort of depth about in specific cases. I think what is becoming clear across the board, if you look, Lebanon, where we live now, is a very interesting place because you have a large Christian population, you have all different Muslim groups, Druze, Armenians, etc. And what's interesting is that in Lebanon, with this tremendous development over the last 9 months, and just today the Security Council met to put more pressure on Syria, is that there is a consensus that's emerging, and I see it across the region, that the antidote to the police state denial of citizen rights in the Arab world and in the wider Middle East, and the denial of people's rights through military occupation, such as Israel has in the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan Heights, or Gaza now they've pulled out, but they still surround Gaza, and the denial of people's rights in problem situations like Iraq and other places, across the board, whoever is doing the denying, whoever is being denied, that the antidote to all these problems is citizenship rights and a constitutionally defined and enforced rule of law which requires, above all, a legitimate government elected by its people under conditions of freedom, and requires, above all, an independent and fair judiciary. Those are the two critical elements that I think people have started to zero in on across the region, that you must have contested political life under the rule of law, you must have free press, opposition groups, political parties, really free to contest life, affirming majority, contest political life, affirming majority rule and protecting minority rights. And if you can do that, then the people themselves will define a government system that is more legitimate, and that, in the long run, is the only way to address these five crises. The problem in the Middle East, broadly speaking, in most Middle Eastern countries, with few exceptions, is that none of the people of these countries have defined themselves, have defined their borders, have defined their identity, their secular religious nature, their tribal national identity, the rights of citizenship, who rules them, relations with Israel, relations with Iran, Turkey, the West, other non-Arab groups. In no Arab country have you had a really serious process of national self-determination. That is why the Arab world is the only entire region of the world that remains run by autocratic governments, in some cases brutal police states, and remains the only part of the world where you have chronic military occupations by foreign countries, and the only part of the world where you have foreign armies regularly marching into the region. And this has to stop. And this is what the people of the Arab world are pleading for, and now actively working. And it is one of the things that the Islamist political movements are saying in their own religious vocabulary, that they want a life of dignity, of equity, of fairness, of justice. And remember, the rallying cry of the Islamists was adala, justice. They want justice and equality. They want good governance. The role of justice in the Islamic tradition is unbelievably important. You know, when people say Sharia law here in the West, it's seen as something terrible. You think of the Taliban. Well, you say Sharia law to a Muslim, and it means to them the rule of law, good governance, that a fair arbiter, somebody who will apply a set of laws that's legitimate to you as a Muslim, and will apply it fairly. So I think it's important to understand, again, this cry, this appeal for justice and equity and good governance and the rule of law that's coming out of Islamic societies. And don't make the mistake of falling into the trap that bin Laden and Zarqawi want you to do, which is to respond to this small group of terrorist criminals and to forget the vast majority, overwhelming majority of decent, ordinary Muslims and Christians in the Middle East who want to live a life of justice and fairness. Sorry. You, and then you.
You said national self-determination. What do you mean by that? Do you mean by means of a constitution, or are you talking about drawing borders?
By national self-determination, I mean basically allowing the citizens of a country to define themselves, their borders, their leadership, their system of governance, their relations with their neighbors, all of the basic elements that define a group of people who see themselves as a nation or a country. We haven't had that process happen throughout the Arab world in any serious way. Most of these countries were created by the British and the French. Most of the leaderships were either picked by the Europeans or took power by military coups.
So they've been defined by somebody else?
Well, many of them were initially defined by somebody else and then were taken over by their own autocratic and police state and corrupt leaders. And with very few exceptions, not all Arab leaders are corrupt and ruthless. Some of them are quite decent. There's been some tremendous human development in the region. The pace of, say, women's education has expanded astronomically, and literacy in many Arab countries. So there's a lot of good things that have happened. But there's more bad things that have happened, and so these tensions have developed.
I was really pleased to hear you mention some of the gains of the civil rights movement in this country and the leadership base of it being so rooted in the church. It seemed to me when you were listing the five crises that several of them had analogous issues that impel the civil rights movement. It also seems to me that one of the most persuasive things that moved the civil rights movement forward was that it had a two-pronged core, and one of them was justice. One was justice which had two prongs. One, political justice, and the other a kind of moral or fairness core, and that they moved forward on the back of something called nonviolence. And so I'm very interested in why the thrust of that and the success of a movement that rests on some of the same concerns has not employed or even thought about nonviolence as a part of moving forward on its own gains.
I think there has been some attempt by some people in the Middle East to look at nonviolent means, but it's just been too little, too late. The nature of the pressures that people have felt, the nature of the tensions and stresses and sort of the inequities that people have suffered from decade after decade simply became too much for any credible nonviolent movement to take place. The other problem is that you never had a response that was commensurate with the demand for justice that came out of society. The Arab rulers, Israel, the United States, Europe, Russia, any place you look, there was no response that was able to adequately give people in the Middle East and the Arab countries, again I speak of the Arab countries which I know best, nobody was able to give them a sense that through peaceful participation they were actually going to achieve their rights. Part of this was because of the Cold War, part of it was the impact of oil, part of it was the Arab-Israeli conflict. There's many reasons for it, but the consequence of it is that you didn't have a successful nonviolent movement. The other problem is that we have had truly mediocre and I would say poor leadership in the Arab countries, in Israel and in the United States. And I condemn all three of them unequivocally and equally. That the American, Israeli and Arab leaderships of the last 40 years or so have been catastrophically mediocre and even I would say criminally negligent to some extent of not being able to respond to the demands of their people. And we had an amazing opportunity in 1993 with the Oslo Agreement, where a majority of Israelis, a majority of Palestinians, the Arab world, the whole world was focused on trying to solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, but they just couldn't get it done for reasons that we don't have time to talk about here. So poor leadership is a problem. Good leadership was a blessing of the civil rights movement in the United States.
I just wonder, you seem to speak as if you take the nations as they were drawn up primarily by the English and the French after the demise of the Ottoman Empire. Now, when you speak, you seem to speak about the nation and the identity. Is there a movement or a feeling in the Middle East that there is another way of structuring things than by individual nations?
There are some thoughts in this direction among some people in the Middle East who might. There's some people who have an idea that, say, a wider Arab confederation, a pan-Islamic identity, some of these small states joining together, some of the states maybe breaking up, like Iraq possibly having a Kurdish nation. These are all legitimate issues, I would say. I have no qualms about saying that we must allow the people of the region to define themselves in the same way that people in the West were delighted, and in Europe when the Soviet Union broke up and you had new states coming into being and some states broke up into two states. So I think you have to let people define themselves. The reality, I would say, though, is that most countries will probably stay as they are if they can be made democratic and therefore allow their people to live a decent life. The major grievance is not the national configuration. The major grievance is the policies under which people live, the policies of the governments, combined with the humiliation that people feel coming from the humiliation and the injustice that people feel coming from Israel, the United States, Europe, the UN, Russia, whoever, external parties, sometimes Iran or whatever, whoever your external threat may be. That's the real major problem.
Hi, like you, I'm Greek Orthodox, and my family came from Constantinople. And I wonder if you could shed any light on Turkey right now, which seems, a very conflicting kind of place where Turkey wants to enter the EU. They're now going to prosecute Orhan Pamuk. for saying that the genocide happened. I mean, what's going on there?
Well, I'm not an expert at Turkey, but that doesn't stop me from talking about it. So, being a journalist, unlike you scholars, I can sort of let it rip any way I want. And, I think Turkey is an unbelievably important experience, and I don't use the word model, but it's an important experience that has huge implications, not just for the Arab world, but I think for much of the Islamic world and the developing world, in the sense that what you've had happen in Turkey is a peaceful democratic transformation that has allowed a mild Islamist party, but an Islamist party, to rule in a democratic way, vastly change the human rights conditions in the country, open up the economy, open up the political rights situation so that the Kurds and other minorities feel that they can express themselves, open up a legitimate debate about the Armenian genocide. And all of this has happened while they are a member of NATO and are trying to get into the European Union. Now, the reason they were able to do this is that because the world gave them a chance. The world was patient with them, and it didn't panic when Islamists won municipal governments, and then didn't panic when the Islamic Party made a deal with other parties and ruled the country, and left the question of accountability of that government to its own people. And in other words, the Turks were allowed to undergo a process of national self-determination. Of course, they've been independent for many decades, but they redefined the nature of their government system, and the most important thing they did, which is a huge challenge which we in the Arab world have to deal with, is to bring the security services under the control of civilian oversight institutions. You must have elected parliaments, independent judiciary and civil society mechanisms to oversee the work of the security services. The security services have ruled with impunity in most of the Middle East for many years and have been a huge reason for the problems that we have, including the problem of terrorism emerging from people, young men in these societies who have been dehumanized to such a point that they eventually turn to terror. And remember that most of the terror is directed at our own societies in the Middle East, not at Israel or the United States. Most of the terror has been directed internally. Some of it has been done by government, some of it done by terror groups. And I think the best example I would give you, to go back to the civil rights movement, the single best book that helps you understand the Middle East, well, there's two books that I recommend. One is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which is the classic story of African Americans. Invisible Man makes you understand what many Arabs feel like. The other book you have to read is David Fromkin's book, A Peace to End All Peace, which is about the emergence of the modern Middle East at the end of World War I. If you read those two books together, you will understand exactly how people feel in the Middle East. And I was struck by Condoleezza Rice the other day raising, again, the issue of Birmingham and her experience as a child and the racism that she suffered. But I must be very honest with you, and I wrote this in a column. I've used the same analogy of the civil rights movement, but in a different way than she has. What happens in the Middle East when people look at the United States, they see Bull Connor. They see the racist sheriff applying a unacceptable standard of justice. This is the terrible, cruel reality that defines us as we look at these issues together. So I'm going to write another column for Condoleezza Rice to read about the real analogy between the American civil rights movement and the situation in the Middle East, because young people in the Arab world are challenging their own government. Those people who went out in the streets in Lebanon and challenged the Lebanese security forces were exactly like the people who went out into the streets in Birmingham and Selma and faced the police dogs and the fire hoses and went to jail singing. They were singing when they went to jail. And so people in the Middle East were challenging their security services in Egypt, in Bahrain, in Syria, not so much in Syria, but a little bit, but in Lebanon. And they were suicidally defiant. They were prepared to die. They were prepared to go to jail. They were prepared to get beaten because they've been dehumanized to such an extent. And even when they turned to their religion was denied them. So their final suicidal, not suicidal in literal terms, but in attitudinal terms, that they were prepared to die if they knew it was dangerous to challenge the security services. And some of them were killed. Samir Qasir and others in Lebanon were killed by the security services. But in these kinds of struggles, people do die. But the majority then end up living in freedom. So it's very important to understand those analogies without losing sight of the fact that some of these people in the Middle East are criminals, and they must be dealt with as criminals and terrorists. I'm not saying that everybody who waves the banner of Islam or talks of jihad or talks of Sharia law is a wonderful person. Some of them are criminals and killers, and they must be dealt with. But the vast majority are not. The vast majority are decent, good people. Paul, I think we have time. One more? Yeah. Paul.
You've presented a tremendous challenge tonight. You also know us and what we have to offer and what we lack. Your address, really, I wish it could be canonized because it's full of implications for us in this faculty. Is there anything, I guess I'm the last question, so maybe this is a testament. Could you challenge us with a couple of suggestions, either in terms of curriculum or our style of learning and community here? We have Arabs who are Muslims or Christian, Copts, we have Egyptians, we have both on our faculty and among the student body, this wide diversity. We have Jews of all types and Christians of all types. This is a rare opportunity, but I think we may not be meeting up to the challenge. Can you leave us with some advice as what we should do here on the ground at Harvard Divinity School?
Thank you. Wow. Really wants to get me in trouble.
We have only 2 hours.
Well, I think, I could give you one quick answer. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses tells the people, presumably relaying the word of God to the Israelites to pass it on to all of humankind, pursue justice and only justice. Pursue justice and only justice. I think if we can understand the meaning of justice in the wider Islamic, American, Arab, Israeli, Iranian realm, in all realms, justice is the common denominator. A sense, it's not wealth, it's not power, it's not dominance, it's feeling justice, feeling that you're treated like a human being. And there's a phrase and there's a quotation from the book of John, which, unlike most of you, I can't quote the Bible by heart except for that from Deuteronomy. But in the book of John, when Jesus was being tried by, I think it was Caiaphas, I'm not sure, and they accused him of something. And he said, if I have lied, then beat me up. If I have spoken the truth, why do you torment me? And I think this is a very critical thing to understand. People speaking out truthfully in the Arab world, in other situations of oppression, the Americans in the civil rights movements, people in the Ukraine last year. When people speak out truthfully, you need to listen to them. Don't oppress them. Listen to them and try to understand the meaning of justice. It's not for you to promote justice. That's up to the secular political leaderships in these countries and the governance system. But I think it's important for you to interpret justice as the operative link between the divine and theology and our common moral ancestry and the ordinary, not just demands and aspirations, but rights of citizens in modern countries. I think this is a role that people in divinity schools are uniquely qualified to play. But pursue justice and only justice for all people. And this is the critical element. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rami, for such an interesting set of remarks. When I first heard about your involvement in Little League Baseball, I thought, how is it that one calls balls and strikes in the Middle East? But you clearly know how to call them as you see them, and I think we've all been stimulated. My sense is that there will be lots of interesting conversations that happen over the next few days as a result of this. I have a few logistical things to share with you, but before I get to those, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge somebody who I know wanted to keep a relatively low profile here tonight, and you can't keep a much lower profile than to sit in the far corner of the last row. But I do want to acknowledge all the efforts of Betsy Sloan to bring together this group tonight and having been so successful at it. Thanks, Betsy. The logistical things are really about tomorrow when our program will continue. The first thing on the agenda is a question and answer session with President Summers, who will, we assume, talk about the role of HDS and Harvard University in studying religion, followed by a keynote presentation by Diana Eck, professor of comparative religion and Indian studies at Harvard, whom most of you know, I believe. Followed then by a panel discussion, Religion and Government, a Global Perspective, which will be moderated by Harvey Cox. Now I'll have to think about that slip. That too. By Harvey Cox, and featuring several of our newer members of the faculty here at the Divinity School. I'm sure that'll be a very interesting panel. Then a luncheon program exploring issues in religion and contemporary life, and a panel discussion entitled HDS, Shaping the Future of Religion and Leadership, featuring several of our distinguished alums. Valet parking at the Academy, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, is available if you request it. If you requested it, please refer to the map in your portfolio for more details and for directions. And speaking of the portfolio, the leather-like portfolio, please bring that with you tomorrow because it has a lot of useful information in it. So thank you very much for joining us, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 8:30. Thank you.